welcome the publication yesterday of the Personal Insolvency Bill, and we are gratified that it takes on board a lot of the suggestions we had made in the legislation that we had brought before the Oireachtas before the Christmas. And it shows that this Oireachtas can really work if everybody is given an opportunity to have an input into legislation. However, we are concerned in relation to your proposals that it leaves the involvement of the banks in relation to secured debt as an optional involvement. And our proposal was radically different in this regard. Now, I think it's fair to say that you yourself have pointed out many, many times in the last 4 years that leaving issues to the discretion of the banks is a bad idea, and that effectively what we're getting here is light touch legislation. And what I'd like to ask you is, since what you're actually doing at the moment
please,
in this legislation is really putting the code of practice into legislation, but you're not giving teeth to it. And could I ask you to reconsider this matter and to ask whether the government will be introducing amendments to the bill to give it teeth, particularly in relation to secured creditors, and in particular in relation to home loans? And what are your intentions to strengthen the bill? Now, as you know, Tánaiste, last week I asked you a question about the ITSB and the interest rates they're charging, and in many cases it effectively is twice the rate that, for example, AIB is charging, and that's having a huge effect on mortgage holders. And I was just wondering, has any progress been made in resolving what is a very straightforward issue? It's basically a state-owned bank, and similarly it's been brought to my attention that the EBS, which is now owned by the AIB and is one of Minister Noonan's pillar banks, and I believe the idea here was to get a bit of convergence.
Thank you,
I was wondering what steps the government are going to take to ensure that there's convergence in the interest rate being charged on home loans by the EBS towards the AIB rate.
Thank you.
And could I also just point out on the ITSB that when they're issuing new loans, they're actually at a lower rate, the new house loans, than the existing mortgage holders.
Tánaiste.
Alaska and Corla, first of all, I want to thank Deputy O'Keefe for welcoming the publication of the Personal Insolvency Bill yesterday. I think it's a pity that he perhaps took a bit of the good out of the welcome by some of the grudging comments in respect of it. I think it's fair to say, Alaska and Corla, that the period of this recession, probably the biggest worry that individuals and families have had, even bigger than the loss of the job or the loss of the business, is the fear of losing their home. People who have found themselves in mortgage difficulties and people who have found themselves in situations of personal debt of one kind or another. And this issue has been addressed by the government in the publication of the personal insolvency legislation yesterday, the most radical reform of personal insolvency legislation that we have seen. And I'd remind Deputy O'Keefe that he had 14 years in government in which to address this issue and didn't. The government has addressed the issue of personal insolvency, introduced legislation which will bring down the period of time to 3 years. That alone will strengthen the hand of borrowers in their discussions with their banks. And then the legislation provides for a range of non-judicial debt settlement arrangements, provision for debt relief certificate in the cases of people who have unsecured debt of under 20,000 or where there's no income and no assets, arrangements for debt settlement arrangements where people again can make a settlement with their bank, and critically the introduction of the personal insolvency arrangement which includes secured debt and will include in that mortgage debt. So for the first time we will now have legislation that will enable borrowers to negotiate debt settlement arrangements on a realistic and reasonable way with their banks and with their financial institutions. And I think it's a good day for this country that for the first time that we now have hope for families and hope for households, that they can see a way of, first of all, them working themselves out of their personal debt situations, and interestingly enough, coming on a day also when, as a country, we have seen the first signs of hope in relation to our re-entry to the markets, with what we saw yesterday with the bond exchange. First time that the country is back in the market since the September of 2010. So I think that this is a very positive development. The legislation, the intention is that the heads of the bill will go to the Joint Oireachtas Committee, will be discussed there, and obviously any improvements that members of the House or detail that they want to discuss can be discussed there, and then will be formally published and hopefully enacted in a relatively short period of time.
Supplementary question from Deputy O'Keefe. 1 minute.
Yeah, I have to say that Taoiseach is a radically changed man in the last year and a half, because basically what happened yesterday was that the ECB lent money to the banks at 1.5%, who have lent it on to Ireland at 5%, making a very substantial gain because of the arrangement of the ECB. And I have to say that I do compliment the NTMA in availing of the opportunity, but the basic structure is wrong, that the big gains here are the private banks, but that's another day's work.
Question, please.
Now, just to go back to the issue, we do welcome the bill. And I think one of the things that you spoke about before you came into government is about interacting with the House and taking on board suggestions, no matter where they come from, if they're good suggestions. Now, basically what you're proposing in your bill is that the banks, in relation to the biggest loan that most people have, i.e. the secured loan, the mortgage on their house, aren't mandatorily forced to get involved in the debt resolution, and that it's an option for them. And as we know in the past, when the banks have options, they don't always take those options in the interest of the customer. And what we're saying is that it should be mandatory, as it is for the unsecured creditors, to get involved. And that's what we're saying, and that's the fundamental change that we need to make this bill effective. If we don't have that, you have a bill that won't work. And Minister Michael Noonan said yesterday that he was hoping for the cooperation of the banks. Now, we know, and you were very critical of the lack of cooperation from the banks right throughout this fiscal crisis, and the fact that, for example, they wouldn't tell us how badly they were scored.
Deputy, this is a supplementary question. Deputy,
I have a question. Now depending on the voluntary goodwill of the banks, I have to say I would have thought above all people that you would have realised that that is a very, very foolish way to go. So my straight question to you is, will you amend the bill to make it mandatory for the banks to engage? And can I finally say, in relation to the bankruptcy issue that you raised, debt resolution should ensure that for the vast majority of ordinary citizens, that bankruptcy will not be the option, and debt resolution will be the option.
Please.
And bankruptcy is the last thing.
Please.
And bankruptcy...
Deputy, please.
Can I finish? Bankruptcy is the last...
Deputy, please. Come on, Deputy. Please, I have to call on the Taoiseach now, Deputy, please.
No, steady.
Please.
Steady now.
Please. Deputy, will you please have the last question?
It's the last place, as you know, that ordinary people dream of going. They want a resolution to their issues. They don't want bankruptcy.
Thank you, Deputy.
And therefore, I'm asking you to deal with this issue.
Order, sorry, order for the Taoiseach. Please.
Well, Taoiseach, first of all, the government will, of course, and is always open to taking on board constructive suggestions from any member of the House in relation to the legislation. And that is why we have decided that the heads of this bill will go immediately to the Joint Oireachtas Committee. We don't intend that that will be a very prolonged period of time. We're looking at perhaps having that process completed by the end of February and then moving ahead with the formal publication of the legislation thereafter. Deputy O'Keefe refers to radical change. This is radical change. There is no other that I'm aware of, no other legislative arrangement of this kind Certainly there has been none in this country to date, nor is there any anywhere else that I'm aware of, which deals with the issue of secured debt in the way that is proposed to be dealt with in this legislation. This isn't some kind of a voluntary, optional arrangement for banks. This is legislation. This is being written into law, a range of non-judicial debt settlement arrangements for the first time, which will give some reasonable prospect that people who have accumulated debts, who find themselves with mortgage debt that they can't pay, some cases people who are facing the awful prospect that they might at some stage lose their home, people who find themselves in negative equity for the first time, for the very first time, now see a prospect and a way of navigating and negotiating their way out of that. And the banks themselves will know that, as a backstop, that the new, completely changed personal insolvency arrangement, the reduction to 3 years, is in place. So this is quite radical legislation. It's new. It is providing a new basis on which people can work their way out of their personal debts, including mortgage debt, and it is for the first time. We've had a long period of time now since this country went into recession, and people have been looking at all kinds of difficulties, both in relation to their jobs, the economy, the country and their own personal situation. For the first time since this country went into recession, individual families and individual households can look with some hope of getting out of the debt that they're saddled with at present, a legislative basis on which they can get debt resolution and a new reformed legislative basis for personal insolvency. And I'm glad, in fact, in fairness to the Deputy, that he has, in fact, welcomed the publication of that legislation.
Next question is from Deputy Mary Lou MacDonald. 2 minutes.
Taoiseach, today you intend ramming the Water Services Amendment Bill, or the Septic Tank Bill as it's known, through the Dáil, a measure that you know will impose great hardship on citizens in this state. I think the use of the guillotine to rush this measure through is cynical. You said a few moments ago that you were open to constructive suggestions in respect of any proposals, but in this particular case, you are rushing this legislation through without having taken or considered the very constructive and fair amendments brought by members of this Dáil. Now, I'm aware that the reality of what's happening today stems from a failure of successive governments, it has to be said, of Fianna Fáil, of Fine Gael and Labour, who failed to comply with the 1975 EU directive. And unfortunately today, what this Dáil tells rural Ireland is that it is the people who will pay for the failure of politics. This legislation should not go through without the full standards by which septic tanks will be assessed being agreed, published and understood, because in the absence of that, fear and panic has spread right across rural Ireland.
Please.
People fear that they will be faced. People fear that they will be faced with bills of several thousand euros that they simply cannot meet.
Order for the Speaker, please.
And Taoiseach, I, like you, support any measure that means that individuals and families, as you have just said, can see their way beyond hardship and debt.
Yes.
However,
Deputy,
this particular measure, advanced in the manner in which you had advanced it, not only causes the fear of further debt, but will in fact bring that reality. So I want to ask you, Taoiseach, how you defend a position that you will rush this legislation through without publishing the standards by which these septic tanks will be judged, and without crucially, offering the reassurance to families and individuals that there will be a fully funded grant scheme to support those families should they have to make repair works to their septic tanks.
Order, please. Stop it. Deputy, that's enough.
That is off.
Deputy, please. Taoiseach.
Well, I think it's a pity that Deputy MacDonald doesn't have the good grace, as Deputy O'Keefe did, to at least acknowledge that the government is dealing with a real issue that families are concerned about and have been concerned about in this country, which is the problem of mortgage debt, and which he, of course, came in here previously and said the government is doing nothing about the mortgage problem and so on. And on the day that we are, doesn't have the good grace to come in and at least acknowledge that, and has to spend all morning trying to find what issue can she find that she can criticise the government on. Now she says, Deputy MacDonald says that the government is rushing this and we're not giving members of the House an opportunity to debate it in detail and so on. Can I tell her that when this bill was before the committee finished 3 hours early, Deputy MacDonald? You had three. You had three. Please. Deputy MacDonald, three. This is 3 extra hours in which you could have raised all these issues. Resume yourself. This issue, Alas Cancorla, is this issue arose.
Taoiseach, just one moment, Taoiseach. I want no more of this farce now. This is proper disgrace. I want Taoiseach to finish. Taoiseach to finish.
The National Parliament.
This issue dates back to 2009 and was not dealt with by the previous government. There is now a 3rd of February deadline within which the Water Services Bill must be enacted. We are facing a situation where the country is facing the possibility of fines, a lump sum penalty of €2.7 million and daily fines of more than €26,000 if this legislation is not enacted and the way of dealing with septic tanks is not put in place. Now, again, what the government is proposing is a reasonable measure. It's a once-off registration charge of €50, and it is an inspection regime that is quite reasonable. And we've, in fact, already seen in County Cavan an example of how that inspection regime has operated. It operates in a very reasonable. Way, and the legislation isn't being rushed. There has been plenty of time provided for it, and it has to be enacted by the 3rd of February.
A supplementary question now from Deputy Mary Lou MacDonald.
Now, some in this House might find this a source of comedy. Can I just remind members that a lot of people who are currently watching us and that we represent don't find this a matter that is funny at all. There isn't a person who doesn't accept, Taoiseach, that we have to guard the quality of our water and that you need a proper inspection regime. That's not the issue. And in fact, the registration fee itself isn't what's causing the difficulty. The problem is that the legislation that you are rushing through, and I repeat, you failed to take amendments from Sinn Féin and indeed from others on these matters, is very explicit, for instance, in the fact that up to €5,000 of a fine can be levied. There's no fudging on that. That's there black on white. But it is the absence of a spelt-out series of standards that will apply to the septic tanks that causes people deep concern. It is also the fact that should a household be faced with significant works to bring the septic tank up to standard, that the state is making absolutely no commitment to those families, the length and breadth of the state, that there will be a helping hand for them. Now, there's little point, Taoiseach, there's little point, Taoiseach, giving with one hand and taking back with another. And I will always acknowledge any effort that is made to assist families that are in financial distress, and we will read very carefully your proposals that have been discussed here this morning. Let me acknowledge them. But let me tell you also that it is unfair deeply unfair of your government to put this legislation through without being absolutely clear with the people in respect of standards. And can I ask you a straight question? Will there be a grant scheme? Will there be assistance for families where they find that in order to protect the water table and the quality of water, that they do in fact have to upgrade?
Thank you, Deputy.
The least rural Ireland can expect from your government is help and assistance on this matter. It's not sufficient to simply rush it through this House.
Taoiseach, please.
Well, first of all, let's talk about fairness. First of all, it is certainly not fair that the taxpayers of this country would have to be in a position after the 3rd of February of facing daily fines because of the failure of previous government, because of the failure of previous government to have dealt with this since 2009. This has to be dealt with, and it is being dealt with now. I think that Deputy MacDonald is confusing the kind of thing that is included in primary legislation and the kind of detailed regulations which are subsequently made in secondary legislation. The inspection regime in this case, in respect of the septic tanks regime, is an inspection regime that will be under the EPA, who have a long experience of inspections, of environmental control, of doing their work in a very reasonable way. And I think what's unfair is not what is in the legislation. I think what is unfair is the approach that is being taken by some members of the House, who are frightening elderly people in particular, that they're going to be caught with all kinds. I mean, doing a kind of, using it to whip up. Using it to whip up fears for political advantage. This legislation has to be put in place by the 3rd of February. Everybody knows that. The charge that is in it is a very reasonable charge, and the inspection regime, which will imply the inspection regime which will be in place will be a reasonable inspection regime under the Environment Protection Agency. And in the meantime, I would urge deputies not to be whipping up the fears of people who have nothing, who really have nothing to fear at all from this legislation.
Deputy Joe Higgins, please. I know. Look at Deputy. Sorry. Deputy Joe Higgins is on his feet. I know. Deputy Joe Higgins. Deputy, we will discuss that later on, Deputy. Deputy Joe Higgins.
It's out of order,
now withdraw that comment. I'm not protecting him, Deputy. Deputy Joe Higgins. I want to make some time. Joe Higgins. Deputy Higgins. Look, that's the end of it, Deputy. Deputy Joe Higgins, please. Please, order, please, for the Deputy.
Taoiseach, in recent days, in press reports arising from briefings by the Minister for Social Protection and senior officials in her department, there is the pointing to the beginning of a campaign of pressure and harassment of unemployed people. Apparently, the Minister is to unveil a programme next week called Pathways to Work. One briefing in regard to that says that every unemployed person in the state will be given a date by which they are expected to be off the register of unemployed. And this process is referred to in a rather sinister turn of term, prediction of exit date, something you might associate more with the sentencing in a capital trial rather than how people in difficult circumstances should be treated. And if they are not off the register by that date, they will face what is referred to as a challenging interview. Apparently, senior officials in the Department of Social Protection are referring to this among themselves as Operation Transformation, referring to an RTE project where people who believe themselves to be seriously obese or overweight undertake a stringent programme to overcome that. And we are told in the same briefings that the Minister's drive will include the unemployed being called to Alcoholics Anonymous-style motivation meetings if they haven't met their exit date. Now, Taoiseach, criminal profiteering and greed by a tiny minority in this state caused the catastrophic collapse of economic activity in the last 3.5 years. Hundreds of thousands of our people, innocent people, lost their jobs. The disastrous austerity policy of your predecessors and your government have kept hundreds of thousands on the dole, unfortunately.
Your question, please, Deputy.
Is it now the case that they are to be regarded as having a serious dependency disease of which they have to be cured? And that the cure is to humiliate and harass them and make it intolerable for them to come and to get their weekly support? Is this how far the Irish Labour Party has fallen in less than 1 year, where before the last election you were to be the champions of the jobless? You brought out extensive documents on it. You were to be the powerhouse of job creation. Now your minister is planning institutionalised victimisation of the very victims of this crisis, revealed in the same week, incidentally, as you reward the perpetrators with €1.25 billion to the speculating bondholders, resources, precious resources that should be indeed going in
Deputy,
to create emergency programmes of work for the victims of unemployment. Now, we are told that the Troika is pushing this, and that follows. The idea of an army of unemployed people in the peripheral countries of Europe competing with each other to be forced into dreadful paying jobs and to drive down wages and conditions, that indeed is part of the programme
Deputy Higgins, I have to call the
Troika.
now.
But
Deputy,
that is the pitiless strategy of capitalism. Can you explain why the Irish Labour Party, founded by the great champions of the victims, Connolly and Larkin and others, are now going to participate in this victimisation, in this classic Tory ploy of blaming the unemployed, blaming the victims for the crisis?
Well, Deputy Higgins has a great penchant for hyperbole, but I have to say that he has excelled even his most outrageous excesses this morning. That he can describe in such lurid terms a government publication that has not yet been published. You might at least wait. You might at least wait. You might at least wait and read it. Firstly, Deputy Higgins, you write in one thing: the government does want to get people off the live register. We want to get people back to work, and that is why we have put forward a range of measures. That's why, for example, this week at the European Summit, we will be proposing a range of measures to provide for jobs and growth, to get the European economy to grow, to get the Irish economy to grow, and that's why we're taking the steps that we're taking to bring confidence back into our own economy, to get investment here, and to get people back into employment. People who are out of work, Deputy Higgins, the approach of the government is to assist those people with training, with education, with job experience where it's appropriate, with internships where it's appropriate, in order that they can work themselves back into employment as the jobs become available. This government has no intention of allowing people to languish on unemployment payments and not take active measures in order to help them back into employment and to improve their skills. The OECD, in fact, has criticised the performance of previous governments in this respect, and that is why Minister Burton, with whom Deputy Higgins seems to have an absolute fascination — I presume it's because you share a constituency with her — That is why Minister Burton is leading an approach which is about reforming our social welfare system, so that it's not about leaving people in long-term unemployment, but that it is about enabling them to get back into employment as quickly as possible. Those proposals and those reforms will be contained in a strategy which she will be publishing shortly, called Pathways to Work. It will include a range of activation measures that will help people re-equip themselves for the workforce, retrain where it's appropriate. And when you talk about interviews with them, it is because people do have individual needs. People who are unemployed are not statistics. We're not talking about percentages. We're talking about people. And individual people have different needs depending on where they previously worked, depending on their level of education and experience. And what Minister Burton is putting in place is a new regime whereby individual people who are out of work will be talked with individually, their needs established, their requirements, their own wishes, and help provided for them using our state system, using the training and education system and labour activation systems to enable them to improve themselves while they are out of work. And that strategy will go side by side with the strategy that government is pursuing in order to get investment into the country, get jobs created, and get the number of people and the individuals who are on the live register off the live register, yes, Deputy Higgins, as quickly as possible and back into gainful employment.
1 minute, Deputy. A supplementary question.
There is one cure for mass unemployment, Taoiseach. That is job creation. And even before that, stop destroying, with your austerity policies, tens of thousands of jobs in the domestic economy. That is why we have 200,000 more people, unfortunately, on the live register now than we had 3.5 years ago. So the creation of real jobs with decent wages, that is the answer to unemployment. But these so-called labour activation measures are an excuse for the non-creation of jobs that your government has been guilty of over the past year or so. Now, unfortunately, the relentless loss of jobs is going to continue in the domestic economy as a result of your policies. In a reply to my colleague, Deputy Daly, the Minister of Social Protection said that this year it's expected that 45,200 more net redundancies, unfortunately, will occur in this state. And in 2013, 40,000. And incredibly, her department is making money available to CE schemes to provide for redundancy of CE workers.
You're over time now, Deputy, please.
How does that square with your pronouncements just now of all that you are going to do for the unemployed? Now, Taoiseach, I would advise you and the Labour Party, and maybe you should advise your minister, be very careful about where the Labour Party is going with this. There are certain billionaire-owned newspapers in this state who are straining at the leash to resume the headlines that they left off in the late 80s about spongers on the dole, about the malingerers and all the rest of it. It is coming close to the surface. They wouldn't dare over the last 3 years because it was quite clear who was the culprit and who was the victim. Maybe they think that now that can be done.
Thank you, Deputy. I have to call
and do you want the Labour Party and your so-called labour activation measures, which are really to blame the unemployed and harass them, rather than create real jobs?
Thank you.
You want to be responsible for that. Can I ask you?
Please don't. Deputy, please.
The end of this month, giving 3 billion, or the end of March, giving 3 billion for the Anglo promissory notes. Put that money into emergency programmes of job creation in public infrastructure, such as the remediation of septic tanks in rural areas, when we will put thousands of people to work. That's the cure for unemployment.
Margaret Taoiseach. Please, Taoiseach.
Well, of course, like all things, Deputy Higgins only sees half of the equation. He quotes redundancy figures, but of course He omits to talk about, for example, the record levels of job creation by the IDA since this government came into office. He forgets to talk about the fact that the levels of trade that the country has achieved in terms of our export, the highest trade surplus ever. What the government is setting out to do, and what we are doing, is to get people back to work by having jobs being created. Now, Deputy Higgins, that means that we have to attract investment into the country. That investment would certainly not be attracted into this country if we were to pursue the idiotic economic policies that you come in here and that you advocate that we pursue. We have to have our economic situation managed in a way that attracts investment into the country, that restores confidence to the domestic economy, and that grows jobs. And that is the strategy that the government is pursuing. Now, as you know, and as everybody knows, we have a huge level of unemployment in this country. It's far too high. 440,000 people on our live register. We want to get that down. Everybody, bar yourself perhaps, Deputy Higgins, realises that that can't be done simply by waving a manifesto at it. It has to be done over a period of time. And people who are out of work, people who've lost jobs, who are out of work, some of whom are out of work for a period of time, have real needs in the meantime. And those needs need to be addressed. And we are not going to leave people who are unemployed aside without their needs being addressed. And that is why we are taking the approach that we are taking, which is aimed at re-equipping them with new skills. People have different needs, may want to change career, may want to move on to something else. And we have a situation in the country where we have training and education bodies. There are budgets available for all of these areas. The Minister Burton's own budget in respect of labour activation measures will be increased from by about 100 million this year, so that we can deal more effectively and fairly and appropriately with the needs of people who are unemployed. So, lest there be any doubt about it, Deputy Higgins, unless you have any doubt about it, let's be clear about two things. First of all, government's priority is creation of jobs, growing our economy, getting people back to work. And secondly, dealing in a fair, reasonable, appropriate and supportive way with the people, Deputy Higgins, not statistics, people who are out of work and who want some hope for their own future in terms of getting back to work and being equipped to do that as quickly as possible.